Hello again, everyone. I'm back with a very exciting video, one that I've been thinking about for a while, but really excited to finally put it, I guess, on tape. And that's all the Russian lit I've been reading lately. It's been tremendous. I've been on such a kick, enjoying every single work that I'm reading, just continuing to dive down this rabbit hole. And I just wanted to kind of, I guess, share a bit of what those books have been, share maybe why I've been enjoying them so much, maybe spark some conversation between all of you watching on what are some of your favorite Russian books, what should I be reading next, because that's definitely something I want to keep pursuing, is sort of the whole canon. And obviously there's a lot to pick from, big names and names that I'm not going to know, and stories and works by those authors I'm not going to know. So that's really the main thing, try to really broaden my perspective horizons with these books. And I guess before I get into the ones I've recently read, just to give a bit of maybe backstory on my reading within Russian lit. So my first book in the Russian world was War and Peace. I actually took a college class, so a whole semester dedicated to War and Peace. I'm not sure if it'd be quite the same way you would describe a book club, but twice a week for 12, 14 weeks, discussed with a class of maybe 10, 12 people, led by a Russian lit professor. And it was just a tremendous experience. I mean, the amount of depth we were able to dive into talking about Tolstoy's philosophy and the characters and development and all aspects of the book were fantastic. I could make a whole video on War and Peace and pieces and bits that I liked, and the critical analysis. We all had to do essays and presentations, kind of critical analysis of War and Peace. So that was my introduction, and for a lot of people that might be a crazy place to start, but I think that sort of softens the blow of anything else, right? If I can read 1,200 pages, obviously self-guided, kind of push me through, then all these other books, page count wise, aren't as daunting. And I think that's what really helped. And then, as I've gotten back into reading within the past, year or so, touching on some of the ones, I can't remember if I would have mentioned them, but I read Dr. Zhivago, really enjoyed that one. Read The Death of Ivan Ilyich, another Tolstoy short work, really enjoyed that one. And then wanted to get into some more of the, I guess, bigger ones, and that led me to reading, well, Anna Karenina, a classic by terms of, it's overly popular, on review websites and things like that. And I think this might be the best one of them all. This was so enjoyable. I loved all the characters and just the amount of sort of uh, you really get to dive into the characters' mentals. And I think comparing between Anna Karenina and War and Peace, I think there's so much of you might call it slow burn, but sort of that development of the characters. Lenin, the main character here, or well, Anna's main character, but Lenin, one of the main male characters, right? We're kind of bouncing between three families, if you will. Is just such a fascinating character. You can almost see, his ideological beliefs contrasting versus the other characters. And obviously, I don't want to give spoilers or anything, but I really think maybe this seems like a daunting book. It could be 800-900 pages depending on the translation. This here is the Pevyar and Volokhonsky translation. It's a Penguin Deluxe. I really like this translation, but I'm sure a lot of the other ones out there are just as good. But I think, I don't know, it's hard to say like just read it, but I think it's one where maybe you read it a really long time ago, or you are afraid it's been sitting on your shelf, or maybe you want to get it from the library. I think you'll find yourself actually pretty interested in a lot of the sort of situations the characters are kind of bouncing between and hiding, and the sort of life that they're trying to progress through. So this was one of the more recent reads, obviously, that I mentioned. Highly recommend. Really enjoyed Anna Karenina. So then after that, this is a gift from my mom. So this is A Swim in the Pond in the Rain by George Saunders. And you're probably saying, okay, George Saunders, that is not a Russian author. And you'd be correct. But what this is it's a collection of, I believe it was 7 or 8 Russian short stories. And George Saunders is a professor he teaches a class going over Russian lit and writing. So it's not only do you get the Russian short stories by Tolstoy, Chekhov, Gogol, I think that might have been it. Let me see. Turgenev as well. But you get sort of, an analysis on the Russian authors and how they write and how short story you have to approach it differently. And I thought that was interesting because I like reading short stories. These were my first Russian ones. And so kind of getting their perspective and understanding how they can be wildly different between authors. There's no one recipe for success. And I think that's what really sort of opened up my eyes to maybe being more critical as I'm reading, being able to see, okay, here's Tolstoy, but comparing it to Turgenev and comparing it to Gogol, like there's just such a wide array of their styles, just as I would recognize in English typical stories that I might read. So this is one where the writing myself, I haven't done too much writing, something that I'll, working on more this year, just doing more writing about books. But the short stories themselves were also very good. I liked having a nice, like I said, range of collections from multiple authors. I think that was really interesting to help, excite my curiosity for more of their short works rather than just maybe big novels like Anna Karenina. So that was Swim in the Pond in the Rain, like I said, short story collection. Then following that, I went into The Master and Margarita. This is by Mikhail Bulgakov. This is a 20th century, I believe, written, and I really like this one as well. I thought it was so wild. There were so many, I guess, just almost obscene things to even put into writing that were fantastic. And it's one of those where I think there were certain chapters especially that really stood out to me. For one, there's a chapter, I think it's in the first part. I think the book's split into 2 parts. It might be 3, but I think it was near the end of the first part where the master's kind of telling you're meeting the master for the first time. And I was just so captivated by his story and the way he was sort of guiding us through his meeting of this mystery woman. I thought it was just a really fantastic scene. And essentially this is a book about, well, 2 things. It's about the master and his relationship with Margarita, but also Jesus and Pontius Pilate and Judas and going back, 2,000 years or whatever. And so I thought it was maybe at first I was a bit lost, bouncing between this world of Moscow and then going back to, the time of Pontius Pilate. But I think once you kind of get that under the belt, I really enjoyed it. Once again, I think this also was, this was also a Peviar and Volokhonsky in a Penguin edition. These were all Christmas gifts, but I really like, one, the cover just looks really, really stunning on this one. It's a 50th anniversary edition here, but yeah, I highly recommend this one. So maybe you're, a bit overwhelmed by thinking of taking on Anna Karenina. Here, this one was, 300 pages, 350. Like I said, it's really light. You're kind of going to be laughing your way through pieces and kind of it's a very joyful read. So I think you'd enjoy it, but it also has those, critical and not critical, but those sort of elements that I feel like I've been getting in the Russian writing, where it's not just jokes, but there's really good prose all throughout. So this was Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita. Really, really enjoyed this one. And then as I've been reading more of these Russian books, it's one where I like I said, I think the characters have been fantastic. The stories themselves have been great, but it's also one where I don't know too much about the Russian history. Obviously, I know the basics, but I want to know a lot about the country itself, origins of it, and so that's what I was really excited to find in this book here. This is Land of the Firebird, The Beauty of Old Russia. And so I'm partway through this one. This is by Suzanne Massie. I think it was from like the 1980s, this book itself. But Massie, you'll recognize the name. Robert Massie does a lot of biographies on Russian figures, Catherine the Great, Peter. And so that's one where, it's kind of cool, it's a family affair to be in that world of Russian history. And this is really fascinating because it starts from the origins before Russia, that land itself, people essentially, creating what is now Moscow and being overrun by the Mongols. And like I said, I'm not too far into it, but what really excited me about this one was it's history, of course, but it also is going to go into a lot of culture. It's talking about Christianity. It's going to talk about music and art. Like I said, how big of an impact religion plays in Russia, which I think it really comes into play with a lot of these books. There's very pious people in these books that so much of their behavior, I think, is driven by those beliefs and by that sort of culture. And so kind of getting an understanding of that from the origins is really exciting to look into. And so, well, I said I haven't finished this one yet. I'm partway through and really enjoying it. I also found another one that's exciting to look at. This is Let History Judge. So this is a history more 20th century, Soviet focus, and this is one where it's giving, I think, a more, obviously, the more modern Soviet picture. And so I kind of wanted to read for this one a bit about, the jacket summary, just to give a bit of what this one has, because I think as someone that hasn't read it, it's hard for me to maybe explain. So this is Let History Judge, The Origins and Consequences of Stalinism. It's by Roy Medvedev. This is and it says it's a revised, expanded edition. I'll touch on that as I read this this intro. So it says, the most comprehensive and revealing investigation of Stalinism and political developments in the Soviet Union, Let History Judge is an extensively revised and expanded version of a classic work. Prominent Soviet historian Roy Medvedev, under surveillance and harassment, has compiled this enlarged edition during a time of great changes for the Soviet Union. This book, revised edition, is, sorry, I know I just stopped in the middle. I want to tell you exactly when this version came out, because I think that might help for those of you that are history buffs. So this is 1989. That might help some of you with your knowledge of what may or may not be included from the author. Let's see. Okay. Attempts to preserve the legacy of the Stalinist political and economic system by conservative or corrupt leaders like Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko have failed. More progressive and liberal leadership has sought to demolish the Stalinist system. Perestroika and glasnost became possible in the Soviet Union not only through the new generation of political leaders, but because the Stalinist political and economic system and the ideology of totalitarianism and confrontation have finally plunged the Soviet Union into prolonged crisis, economic stagnation, apathy, and public discontent. Let History Judge contains new material on the purges of 29 to 31 and the terror against the peasantry, on the Kirov assassination and the infamous show trials, and the Great Terror of 36 through 38, which caused irreparable damage to the Soviet Union and left it vulnerable to Hitler's attack in 1941. There's information on the trial of Bukharin, whose reputation has recently been restored, and a section on Trotsky's revolutionary activity and Stalin's involvement with his murder in Mexico. The book contains new information on Stalin's miscalculations and errors during the war, which cost the Soviet Union nearly 25 million casualties. It chronicles new purges from 1946 to 1953 and asserts a stronger position on certain issues which were introduced in the first book, such as the actual vote of the 17th Congress, which decided Stalin's candidacy. And I think this next sort of section is what really hooked me into buying it. It said, since the first edition, which was finished by the author in 1969 and published in 1971, so this is almost 2 decades later, dozens of new informants, some of whom survived Stalin's death camps, have come forward. They left Roy Medvedev their archives and unpublished memoirs. There are also several hundred new interviews in this edition. Such prominent Soviet literary, cultural, and political figures like the late Alexander Twardorovsky, Ilya Ehrenburg, Konstantin Simonov, Yuri Trifonov, Mikhail Rohm, and many others have accumulated documentary records of Stalinism in anticipation of an expanded version. This classic work is brought up to date in coverage and reproach. And so I think it's just one where, like I said, I know so little about the history itself, and getting this, what seems like a very primary view from a lot of these sources, and what, to me, Roy Medvedev seems like an expert on the subject. Really excited to kind of get into this history when I finish Land of the Firebird, because I think that'll be a good maybe transition from the softer artistic cultural view into the more political harsh view, kind of Stalinism. So that here, this is Let History Judge. Excited to read this one. And now we're going to get into a couple new purchases that I got just to sort of think about the next reads. And this is where, once again, I'm curious what some of you might think. So obviously I've read Tolstoy. I've read Crime and Punishment. I guess I forgot to mention that as well. But I guess it's looking into, lesser known works by famous authors or other authors. And I found a list online with some really interesting books that I haven't found. My library has a very poor selection of these Russian works by these non-major authors. One of those being called We, just W-E, by Zamyatin. And the little description when I look up that one says it was used as inspiration for George Orwell's 1984. Right there, that sounds fantastic to read. So that's on the lookout list. I also, like I mentioned, just recently picked up, here's Ivan Turgenev's On the Eve. And now Turgenev, I believe, is the author of Fathers and Sons, his more famous work. And so didn't see that, but when I saw this Penguin Classic of On the Eve, figured, what's a few bucks? Let me pick it up. It'll take me, a night or two to read. So going to be reading this one. Also found a little version here of Dostoevsky's The Possessed. Don't know anything about this. I know he wrote Demons, The Brothers Karamazov. I haven't read yet. Not sure, maybe with all the Tolstoy works, you think there's a good order to read them in. Like I said, I already read Crime and Punishment. Is there something I should read next? Notes from Underground. Is it okay to read Brothers Karamazov next? Maybe you can sort of point me in the right direction, or maybe here, The Possessed. Maybe this is a good one to just get into because I have it right here. And then the next one here that I found, this is Pushkin, right? So the famous playwright. This is Eugene Onegin. I'm not actually sure how to pronounce it, but I know this is, when I mentioned those lists I was looking up, this is one of them that kept showing up. So saw this nice little cover and figured, why not pick it up. This picture I actually really like on the front. It's the jacket painting is Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin with his wife Natalia Gonkarva at the court ball from 1937. So I think it's a really nice little picture. So excited to read this one, right? This is more sort of poetry, right? It's going to have not your typical novel style, but I think, or poetry, playwright. I guess I'm not actually sure the appropriate term for this one, but this was one, I know I'm kind of bouncing all over the place, but when I was looking at it at the store, I mentioned earlier, a lot of the ones I had read were Peviar and Volokhonsky. Some of these newer ones are a whole host of translators, and obviously the history is written in English. But here, this is translated by Vladimir Nabokov, and there was a piece in here about translation that I thought was really fascinating. And if I can quickly find it, he was touching on how translation works, I believe, and how you can, obviously you're going to lose a lot of the magic that you have in Russian lit, or any language, right? If you're translating out of Spanish or French or Japanese or anything, you're going to lose some of the magic of what that language offers. Let's see. No, so I'm not seeing it here, but essentially it was touching on, there's multiple ways to translate. There's multiple ways to sort of put the typical Russian or whatever language you're working on into English or the desired translation language. And so the translator has to make choices. They have to make sacrifices, and you're never going to get the true, I guess, like ethos of what that story or those words may have been. I think that this also came up in, the George Saunders short story collection, where he said he was teaching a course, and over the years, would have students who are fluent in Russian, and they're able to kind of catch the more nuanced, maybe meaning, if they look up the original Russian compared to the translation they're working on in class. And so I think that's something where, with some of these, maybe reading, obviously, the multiple translations of the same work would offer a differing opinion. Maybe you read multiple and you have a favorite, or you think having read multiple translations of a certain work did a lot of benefit or goodwill for you. So I'm curious about that too. Maybe you have some thoughts on that. But just a lot of rambling here on the Russian lit, and as you can see, I have a lot more I want to read, both the fiction and the historical as well. And then there's obviously biographies. So reading, biographies on a lot of these famous Russians, I think, is something I'll definitely dive into. I know I like reading. Well, I mentioned, Suzanne Massie wrote this Land of the Firebird. Reading the biographies on the Russian figures, but also on those authors by, I don't know if Robert Massie has them on other people, but I'll keep my eye out for those, and curious if any of you have thoughts on anything that I've mentioned here. Once again, hope you're all doing well, and happy reading.